All right, what's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com. And speaking of the title of the video, so mostly it's kind of to accentuate a difference in kind of what the projected message is, right? And I say this because I found a blog post on the New York Fed's blog, Liberty Street Economics, basically about their DSGE model, which is the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. And as a disclaimer, I'm not familiar with the in-depth interworkings of it. It looks like it basically just uses a bunch of different surveys. Just briefly looking over it, you got the survey of primary dealers, the survey of professional forecasters, that sort of thing is in here. I'll probably look more in depth into it specifically later, right? And maybe do a whole video about it. But basically, this model from the New York Fed is basically contradicting the main message that the board of governors is giving, right? And so it's one of those, are they explicitly lying or just kind of playing politics? And it's one of those, you kind of have to see it for what it is, I guess we'll say, and where the incentives are for the board of governors in general, right? And so basically this post is giving an update from the recent one of given in June. And basically, as usual, I'll say it since they did so. um, The whole model, the forecast is not an official forecast from the New York Fed. It's only the input of the research staff's overall forecasting process, as they say in their own words. Highlighted so it's easier to see. So, with that being said, the outlook compared to June is slightly more pessimistic in terms of inflation and broadly unchanged in terms of real activity, right? So, on the one hand, the model sees the underlying state of the economy as stronger than it did in June, as evidenced by the higher projections for the real natural interest rate, right? And basically, this model, or I'm sorry, the model this time projects the real natural interest rate to be 1.4% versus, and this is for 2022, because they basically, it seems like they project this model throughout 3 to 4 years. Like I saw one stat in here where they went out to 2025 to kind of what they're trying to forecast. Obviously, the further it goes out, the more there's kind of sway, we'll say, in what can happen. Same thing with like interest rates and that sort of stuff. But anyways, so there's that. And basically it looks like it's anywhere from 50 to 10 basis point difference between the as you progress in years to what this model was projecting from its previous projections, right? So basically it's revising its own projections. It's a model, that's what it does, right? And so for 2022 it goes from 90 basis points to 140. And again, this is the real natural rate of interest. And then it just kind of, those numbers slowly connect. Or I'll say converge as you continue through time going out to 2024. So, on the other hand, monetary policy is expected to be substantially higher or tighter than in June, not only in absolute terms, but also in relative to the more elevated real natural interest rate, right? And so they say these two forces roughly cancel each other out in terms of output growth. So basically, a higher natural interest rate, how much interest can the economy withstand, basically? Um, the real natural interest rate is kind of, at what point of interest is the basically the economy not expanding or contracting, right? And so basically they say this is 1.4%. So assume that's the actual real natural interest rate. So if you have interest rates above that, it's contractionary. If it's below that, it's expansionary, that sort of thing. Or at least that seems to be the thinking of this interest rate in general. Now, whether or not it's like that in practice, completely separate question, right? But the main reason I wanted to emphasize this is as part of output growth, right? So it's projected to be slightly lower for 2022 at negative 0.7% versus negative 0.6. So growth or output growth is kind of declining according to the model. And then also the model projects slightly higher growth for 2023 going forward a year. So higher growth than 2022. But what are the numbers? Negative 0.4% versus what they projected in June, which was negative a half a percent. And then once again, lowers the growth forecast for 2024, which at least this time it's positive, to 0.1%, right? Of what their new projection is. So it's one of those things, the general, I guess, narrative, for lack of a better term, that you're seeing from the Board of Governors and that sort of the kind of the concept of the Fed, however you want to put it, what we're basically being told is, and I even went over a speech yesterday about this whole thing. Is like, I think which governor was it? I think it was Michael Barr, if I remember correctly, from the speech, basically talking about, like inflation's way too high, but all the debt, every time we get more data coming out, it's burying the idea that the US is in a recession, right? But still, their same models are projecting it to be negative growth until more than a year out. So I've noticed there's some argument of whether or not the whole like 2 quarters of negative GDP, whatever, is not a recession anymore. Or regardless, that's not the point of the video. But there's that kind of argument going on, right? And so, okay, so if GDP contracts for 2 quarters, that's not a recession. Fine, whatever. But if you're projecting it to do so for another 5 quarters, and then the next 4 quarters after that, it's only supposed to be 0.1% projected to be. Obviously, take that for what you will, always with a grain of salt with forecasts. So, but still, it's like, how do you not be like, this is probably a recession or not, whatever? And then even the next few sentences in here, the DSGG, wow, the DSGE still sees a fairly high likelihood of a recession in the next couple years. The probability of a not so soft landing, as at least once over the next 10 quarters, remains 80%. So, I mean, it's not exactly like you're projecting or forecasting weather, right? And so, 80% chance of rain, it may or may not happen. And that's coming from someone who lives in Florida. So, I've literally gone for a walk and it said 1% chance of rain and it just completely downpours. Like, it's, yeah. Regardless. So, and basically what they're defining this as, this not so soft landing, quote unquote, is defined as 4 quarter GDP growth dipping below negative 1%, right? So kind of contraction below, or I guess more than 1%. So the output gap is expected to turn negative in the medium term, declining from 0.8% at the end of 2022 to negative 0.3% in 2023, negative 1.2% in 2024, and negative 1.7% in 2025. So it just keeps going, right? Um, right. And so also kind of a small comment on inflation. The model attributes the current high inflation less to transitory factors such as supply disruptions and more to persistent factors, right? So the whole transitory talk is kind of getting thrown out the window, per se. And then you have a little chart with the forecast comparison. Basically, you have GDP growth, you have core PCE inflation, and then you have the real natural rate of interest. And so you can see how this is progressing through, looks like basically every half year or so, taking September and June. These are the different forecasts. So comparing the 2022 projections for these three factors, you can see where this forecast was lower in terms of GDP growth, higher in terms of inflation, and higher in terms of the real natural rate of interest. And you can scroll through here and see how that kind of changes even to out to 2025, right? To where you see the GDP growth is revised down in the projection. PCE inflation is still up, and then same with the natural rate of interest, right? So again, kind of having a general consensus as the forecast goes out a few years. Keep in mind it's a forecast. And now also kind of looking at the charts. that they have. So this is forecast of output growth. These are all 4/4% changes. So the red line is the actual percentage, or I'm sorry, the actual forecast. And then these gray kind of areas are the different kind of probability kind of ranges in a way. What I mean by that is they call them probability intervals. And so basically, it's like the darkest, most inside one is a 90% probability interval. So basically, they deem a 90% chance that this red line, when we actually go through that time, is going to be somewhere in this area. And then the lightest gray one, all the way on the outside, is the 50%. So there's a 50% chance it'll be within this range, right? And so you can see that to where basically output growth is negative until we'll say 2024 or so, and then it starts to become slightly positive, right? And then you come down here to the annualized one, and this is the difference between the models, right? I'm sorry, the forecast from June to September, where you have, I believe, the gray one is the new September one. No, I misspoke. The blue one is the new September one, and the gray one is the June forecast, right? And so it's one of those things for this one, it didn't really change in terms of output growth, at least not noticeably to the eye. Um, but when you get down to inflation, it's a bit of a different story. So if you noticed in terms of the actual forecast, you see inflation start to come down. Again, this is PCE inflation specifically. And then with the probability intervals, you can see the range seems a bit narrower in general, but they're all kind of tapering down in a way. But even the top of this range is still above 4%, right? Or about, we'll say at 4%, coming all the way down to below 1 in terms of the 50% probability interval. And then you come down to the difference in forecast, and there's actually visible separation in the curves, right? So again, you can see the shift up in the new forecast to where it's very obvious around now ish. We'll say that mid to late 2022, it seems. You see a major break in the forecast, and then you can see kind of a uh, 30 to 40, we'll say, just roughly eyeballing it, kind of delta between the two lines, where this PCE inflation is supposed to be 30, almost half a percent, whatever, higher for the new forecast, right? Now down to the real natural rate of interest. What I like about this one is this area here where you can really see, even though we had data, and that time's obviously already passed for the 2020 to we'll say 2021, you can notice they actually kept the probability intervals for this time period, and you can see them just explode around the actual recorded data. And keep in mind these are probability intervals, so it was really kind of to emphasize that point, um, especially since during this time was massive uncertainty with regards especially to the economy with lockdowns and all that sort of thing. And so you really see that with the probability interval really exploding relative to this, right? And so you can see it even leaves the 20% top of the graph in the end of 2020, right? And so yeah, as always, I'll put a link to this post in the description so you guys can see it for yourselves, read it, and discuss it in the comments if you'd like. Especially with the graphs, too. Kind of like if you guys see something that I did not explicitly state or something like that. Especially like look at the real natural rate of interest here to where it's basically leveled off until 2026 in terms of the forecast, right? And so I don't know if you can kind of see a tiny bit of a dip, and then it just levels off. And then you kind of see the same thing with the probability intervals to where it's pretty much constant. Maybe it kind of broadens a little bit, but that's it, right? So again, that's pretty much it for this one. So basically, depending on how much weight you want to put in this model. Again, I'm not 100% familiar with exactly how things are calculated in it. I just know that there's some weight put in it for decisions, maybe not explicitly from the Board of Governors or whatever, but at least the research staff um, does it. Now, is it useless? I don't know, but it's worth looking into more. So, anyways, I'm going to leave this one here. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.